759th contact, Friday, November 6, 2020, 21.20 hours. 22.32 hours. Translated with deephell.com. This is an excerpt. This is an unofficial English translation and will contain errors.
Hello, to a dear friend. There you are. You told me that you wanted to talk about the corona epidemic again today, because you wanted to say a few more things about it. Actually, we wanted to refrain from doing so some time ago, but the whole thing made it necessary to say more about it, because those in power are neither clever enough nor capable of doing everything that is necessary and right to get to the bottom of the epidemic and put an end to it.
That is correct. But I still want to say something again, according to which we really should not mention this matter anymore, as we have already said once. Now, however, I have found a record in my father's annals, in which he wrote the following under the date of Sunday, April 4, 1948, on the one hand, which he explained to you, Eduard. In the future you will continue to compose your knowledge of all that we have fathomed together about events and happenings far into the distant future yourself in prophecies and predictions and send them to the public media all over the world, as before with the help of your teachers, the priest and the professor. But this will change, as you have seen and know, in the next millennium. Everything will begin to change in just 3 decades because, as you could see in the future, a digital and electronic technology will emerge and open up to you the possibility of using this new technology and through it spreading all your knowledge in a worldwide way. It is then recorded that my father Sfath instructed you to write a letter to all governments and public media in Europe, which you then did on Saturday, July 7, 1949. After that, however, you explored with my father the next 6 decades from 1970 to 2030 and learned how, why and by what means the viral corona plague will arise and then evolve over the next decades to become the plague. This, my father wrote, would first emerge in mild forms to mutate itself over time, as well as by researchers who were deliberately commissioned by Mao Zedong in agreement with the vengeful American, under threat of death, to begin their evil work, which is how it all came about. However, I cannot understand why you want to keep the name of this man secret from the public, because he died, just like Mao Zedong, before the plan of revenge that the two of them had devised together could be implemented, but is now being fulfilled for them posthumously, so to speak, but not only in the USA as planned, but worldwide. What is written further in my father's notes, however, is that in China, in a secret laboratory in the city of Guangzhou, a virus will be created that will escape from a laboratory for the first time in 1976 as a result of carelessness. This virus would mutate several times until the new millennium and remain undetected by all research, only to cause the first recognizable outbreak of the disease in the first 3 years of the new century. This, however, would again undergo a division in a secret laboratory in a Chinese city called Wuhan through further mutation in the laboratory, from which a new type of virus would be formed. This new virus, my father noted, would then be extremely contagious and would attack the cell system of humans, as well as certain mammals and animals, as soon as it was released. And, he noted, there would also be another mutation at the beginning of 2019, through a laboratory accident, whereby the new dangerous virus would affect all laboratory workers, who would gradually die through this infection and the resulting epidemic, but would still carry the epidemic out. This would then last from the month of January until December, before by a stroke of providence the deadly virus would be detected in December 2019, but it would then still take around 2 months before the relevant information was published and the public informed. Furthermore, my father noted in his annals that when the new virus becomes openly recognizable and this proves to be an extremely dangerous, deadly, rampant epidemic, it can no longer be contained. He also noted that before the outbreak of the first recognizable epidemic shortly after the turn of the millennium, by which SARS was probably meant, the virus was not recognized as a special virus for more than 2 decades. This was despite the fact that this virus, which was the first to escape unnoticed from the secret laboratory as early as 1976, mixed undetected with the original so-called porcine influenza subtype H1N1 virus and was highly contagious. The first appearance of this new virus, which integrated itself into the influenza virus, mutated from then on together with influenza viruses without being noticed and thus not recognized by the earthly experts, probably because such processes were unknown to them, which according to our findings is still the case today. As a result of the non-recognition of this mutative type of virus, all the years during which the virus underwent further mutations, only the corresponding type of flu was treated, as we were able to find out according to our research. On the one hand, my father's faith described this in his notes, while on the other hand, he also stated that the disease itself mutated during the next 2 decades after it was first released, so that the first open epidemic emerged shortly after the turn of the millennium. This, he noted, would then change through further mutations and from the beginning of 2019 would cause the start of a major epidemic, which, however, would not occur until the end of the year. It will then begin to spread very rapidly throughout the world from 2020 onwards, will continue to mutate and become even more dangerous, causing many deaths over a long period of time. So much for what is listed in my father's annals. But what you are, ...
It's okay, you don't have to say anything else.
But, ...
No, really. On the one hand, the whole of what you have mentioned from the annals of Sfath does not go into the heads of the entire earthly elite of physicians, virologists, epidemiologists, other scientific experts and greats, because they have no knowledge whatsoever of such mutation occurrences. Consequently they will reject everything outright and present it as fantasy from the outset. In particular, it will be the virologists, epidemiologists and other related experts who will oppose all that Sfath has written and you have now openly mentioned, and they will do this because, as a result of their respective scientific training, they consider themselves to be omniscient and gods and can neither imagine, accept nor allow anything other than what is known, proven and what they have learned so far, as well as their hypotheses. On the other hand, they will not only reject Sfath's statements and thus also everything you have revealed, but will also call you and me liars, falsifiers of the truth and slanderers of the truth, just as all our traditional antagonists will do, as will all the stupidly stupid know-it-alls, troublemakers, lateral thinkers or non-thinkers, conspiracy theorists, all slanderers and other stupid and crazy people who are inaccessible to reason. And all this also rubs off on the politicians, who faithfully hang on the lips of virologists and epidemiologists etc. Let themselves be guided by them and even support them in their delusion of self-divinity. Unfortunately, this is also the case in Switzerland, where the majority of those in power are particularly conspicuous, namely the National Council and the Council of States and, in the highest position, the Federal Council, and especially those women and men who stand out as stupid, clumsy and pompous when they have to or should have to inform the population about all the necessities concerning the corona epidemic. As a rule, however, nothing clever comes out of this, but only inadequate and meaningless sham information, through which nothing concrete is explained, but only the population is irritated with big and stupid speeches, while these would-be representatives of the people try to make themselves look ridiculous. As far as the majority of the Federal Council, the National Council and the Council of States are concerned, as we have been able to see all the time over the last few months through their television appearances, they are believing in the virological and epidemiological super-gods, who are the actual advisors of the government regarding the corona epidemic, but who effectively govern, because the government does exactly what the gods chew them up to do. And the government grows has a special flair for this, namely because, due to their own incompetence, they surround themselves with government advisors, according to whose advice they then govern, whereby it is not the rulers who govern but, clearly seen, the advisors, who are paid immensely expensively with tax money. All this precisely because the rulers are also in bondage to these advisors and have no governance skills of their own. If we take a closer look at the intellect and reason of the minority and the majority of the ruling class, it becomes clear that the minority has no chance whatsoever to bring its considerations, advice, insights, evaluations, ideas, views, opinions, knowledge, experience, perspective and intelligence to bear. If the minority wants to rise up and put forward its rational and rational considerations etc., then it is simply completely disregarded, considered moronic or simply shouted down and put out of action. It is not only the virologists and epidemiologists who are the great new gods, saints, stars and the government leaders or the actual power holders of the rulers in connection with and as a result of the corona epidemic. The belief in God and thus the false doctrines of the religions also play a major role, because the majority of the Federal Council and the National Council as well as the Council of States blindly believe
God will probably fix it, that the epidemic will end again and everything will be fine, because God loves people.
Consequently, the God barns, houses of worship, prayer temples and ascension launch pads can, should and must also be kept open so that they fill up with believers for sermons and prayers and they can become infected en masse with the coronavirus, fall ill from it and possibly die. Every religion, every sect and every belief in an imaginary and therefore non-existent God, or otherwise in an alleged higher power that rules and directs everything, lives and exists on the one hand solely from the stupidity, which corresponds to nothing other than non-thinking, of the believing people. On the other hand, every religion, every sect and every belief in an imaginary and therefore non-existent God lives on the promise of lies given by religion that God, the Lord, will reward the good behavior of people in any case if they pray diligently to Him or if He Himself, or in the case of Christianity His alleged Son, is worshipped and idolized. This, just as God also shows mercy when people diligently visit the house of God, when they beg the pew or press their faces into the mud, depending on their faith, and when hefty large sums are donated as much as possible, so that the religious leaders of all kinds can keep themselves healthy at the expense of the faithful and lead a good life. If we now look at the trappings since the outbreak of the corona plague from a normal, rational point of view and not from the point of view of delusions of faith, and thereby eliminate every religious and sectarian compulsion to believe, then the reality of reality and its truth can be seen, which frighteningly and clearly prove that every religious and sectarian delusion and its promises are built on lies, false promises and slander. And this is particularly clearly demonstrated from the beginning of the corona plague to the present day, for since the beginning of the plague an eclipse of life has spread to all people, contrary to the lie of faith that Emmanuel alias Jesus is supposed to have said,
I am the light of life.
Which he never said, but, truth alone is the light of life. If in any religion or sect which necessarily believes in a God, Son of God, in other deities and heavenly rulers, etc., its promises of salvation are considered, then since the outbreak of the corona plague the whole God belief delusion can be seen particularly clearly, namely, that the earthlings' delusion of faith in God and their faith-conforming behavior has so far brought no protection against the corona plague, offers no protection and will never offer any protection. This, just as there has never been any protection from disease by a delusional fantasy figure, a God the Father, Creator, and similar rationally degenerated imaginary fantasy creatures in any religion or sect since time immemorial. On the contrary, since time immemorial, all God believers have been particularly guilty of allowing deadly epidemics to spread and become rampant and millions of people to die as a result. This was especially because they indulged in their delusional belief in God and thus provoked and spread the epidemics themselves, which they were not aware of in their stupidity. What the God believers did in this respect was that they gathered in the ascension launching pads and thereby infected each other with epidemic viruses. So they gathered in their so-called places of worship such as churches, temples, chapels, synagogues and mosques, etc. where, since time immemorial, as a result of the gathering of God delusionists, deadly viruses can spread particularly well and quickly, cause epidemics and thereby trigger epidemics and pandemics that bring death, misery, suffering, sorrow and ruin. The principles of delusion have not changed since time immemorial and will continue to exist for a long time to come, bringing a great deal of misery to the world of believers in God, but also involving all those who are committed to reality, truth, reason and reasonableness, and causing them equal harm. So it will be through the stupidity of various irresponsible and incompetent rulers, especially the God believers, that in the new upcoming lockdowns, which will come next month and continue into next year, as I have seen together with Sfath, the God barns will not be blocked in the long term to eliminate these epidemic spreaders. But it will unfortunately be as it has always been, because the God delusionists, and these are the giant gra of earth humanity, will not understand that there is no God the Father, and no Creator to protect or protect it from the corona plague. Therefore, people have always been helpless in relying on a non-existent God. And so helpless they are today and will be in the future. Thus, in the future, believers in God will always be the people who will be most affected and suffer the most harm. This is especially because they, as believers in God, are alienated from reality and truth and do not recognize the truth and do not acknowledge that no God will ever bring help, because they cannot understand that a God will never stand by their side and will not help them either, but that they themselves must be given this help. That is why the corona plague hits the God delusionists much harder than other people who are turned towards reality and truth and are free from God belief. The fact is, however, that unavoidably, especially due to the delusion of God of the majority of humanity, by the end of this year only officially worldwide about 2 million people will die from the corona plague and almost 80 million will fall ill and suffer late damages. But this will not be the end of the whole thing. The emergence and living through of fear of the future, insecurity in life, as well as suicide and rage, etc., will not help to put an end to the corona epidemic, because only reason and rationality and the right action can help to control the epidemic to such an extent that it subsides and dissolves to such an extent that it is no longer a daily danger. It will never be possible to eradicate the virus, however, for it will remain underground like any other virus, and only as long as humanity itself is concerned about keeping it in exile. It is still raging, however, and will be even more so in the time to come, because the stupidity of the incompetent rulers has made them act in an absolutely reckless manner and will continue to do so. This is in addition to the fact that 1/4 of the so-called civilized, in reality uncivilized, world population, stupidly cross-questioning, is making the whole thing worse and will continue to do so, as well as denying the epidemic. Already some time ago a complete loss of control has emerged from the stupidity of the governing and the querulous masses, as a result of which the corona plague crisis is now building up to a height that only prudent tough measures must be taken to prevent it from spreading further and becoming more rampant. If this is not done in the coming month and thereafter, the corona death toll would become the final catastrophe and rise to 500 million. Now, I have not forgotten that I also want to mention the so-called medical experts, because they also have a great influence on the rulers around the world at the time of the corona epidemic, so also here in Switzerland on the Council of States, the National Council and the Federal Council. In addition, the majority of these people have their heads filled with the knowledge or ignorance of other scientists, as well as with the dubious theories of strange researchers who act as economic representatives, some of whom criticize everything stupidly and ignorantly, but nevertheless various national and state councillors as well as federal councillors blindly follow the recommendations of these so-called researchers, which has serious, malicious consequences.
What you say corresponds to everything that cannot be disputed, but which will be disputed by all truth opponents, know-it-alls and the irrational, as well as by the stupid and intelligent, for whom the cultivation of healthy and logical thoughts is impossible because of their belief in a deity.
Unfortunately, this will not change until the distant future. What we should talk about now, however, is the origin of the corona plague, because the experts are spouting all kinds of nonsense about it. It seems to me to be like prehistory and paleontology, where certain hypotheses are downright ridiculous because the facts of reality are quite different from the ideas.
But we don't need to talk about that. From our point of view, and according to our research, the first corona plague arose and was released as a result of carelessness as the first virus spray form as early as the 1970s. But was then released again in 1981 from a laboratory in Guangzhou and began to spread. Since then, according to our very precise counts, this form of the epidemic has claimed around 14.71 million lives all over the world, although the entire sciences of medicine, virology and epidemiology, etc., have never been able to identify what it really killed countless people. This first virus mutated further in the course of 2019 and turned into the well-known COVID-19 coronavirus disease 2019, which was previously assessed and treated over 4 decades usually falsely as flu effect and other diseases, and from which nearly 15 million people have died so far, whose disease was not recognized as a corona disease. And what I have to say about that relates to the fact that this death toll also includes the so-called dark figure of corona disease deaths that have occurred since the officially recognized outbreak of corona disease last year, just in December 2019, up to 6 days ago on 31 October, and that this plague will slowly spread into a pandemic and will be rampant worldwide and will now claim millions of victims. You too, my father Sfath and you, already learned about this in 1949, and about this, after your letter of July 7, 1949. You wrote another letter only a few days later, on Sunday, July 12, 1949, which was then sent by Father Zimmermann in 1463 copies throughout the world to all governments, radio stations and many authorities and organizations.
Now that you mention it, I remember. The Horatans and the Methodist sect also picked up on that and always scolded me for it when I passed by the sect's premises on my way to the Solly. But what I can say about what you have just mentioned is that, unfortunately, even today, with all the information we publish on the internet, concerning the corona plague and the teaching of truth, teaching of creation energy, teaching of life, it will be the case, as usual with the earthlings, that only a few will turn to it. There will be only a very few people who are devoted to the truth and to understanding and reason, who have been able to free themselves from the delusion of an imaginary God and will pay attention to everything, while the majority, who are addicted to the belief in God, prefer to hope that they will be helped by their diligent prayers and supplications to their non-existent God.
What you say, as you always say, has a lot of substance, but what you and my father's faith have experienced together has shown you how inept, irresponsible and incompetent all state leaders worldwide will effectively be in the present time, and not only with regard to the raging corona plague crisis. That is one thing, and the other is that everything that has been discussed between us so far and also published on the internet corresponds exactly to what you wrote back then and what was sent out into the world, but even then brought no response whatsoever, as is officially not the case today. It is true, as we have noticed for some time now, that certain persons of various organizations and offices etc., if I may say it in this way, take up these and those important things from your and my statements, explanations and information and use them for their purposes, their office and for their personal advantage etc., but as a rule they are so immersed in craters of discouragement that they cannot stand by them and pass off everything they say, order or do as their personal intelligence.
That is unfortunately the case, on the one hand, but on the other hand, and this is also possible, their encouraged behavior may also be due to pathological inhibitions.
That can be, of course, but as you always say, it is good when the important information that is given brings benefit and success. This is exactly when it comes to leading peoples, because especially in this regard it would have been the duty of the leaders of all states in principle to take the right steps already at the beginning of the corona epidemic in order to prevent an epidemic and the following pandemic. However, in this matter, all the leaders of all the states on earth, as a result of their inability to lead, have allowed the whole of the epidemic to become a crisis. All of them have not fulfilled their duty and will not do so in the near future, which will result in many more infected people and deaths worldwide, especially in the coming weeks. And this will be the case in the United States of America, in Brazil and in South America, as well as in Europe, where the epidemic will claim a particularly large number of victims as a result of the irresponsibility, incompetence and lack of prudence of the leaders of the state and of the querulous part of the population, as you wrote in the aforementioned letter of 1949, which my father enclosed in his annals as a typewritten original, so that I do not have to translate it. I would like to mention in passing that I did not know that you already had a typewriter for writing at that time, but you needed one, because if you did all your work on prophecies and predictions, ...
Sorry, you really couldn't have known that. Thanks to Father Zimmerman, I was able to learn how to use a typewriter. When I moved away from Beulah, I gave this machine to my old friend Ernst Mayerhofer for safekeeping. He probably still has it today. Unfortunately, I haven't heard from him for a long time. But while I'm listening, what can you let me hear about the epidemic in Europe?
The populations of Spain, Germany, Italy and Switzerland will be the main victims of the incompetent state leaders and the fallible part of the populace's troublemakers, who will become culpable for this. At present, there are only a few rational and sensible people in the state leaderships who are aware of the danger and the excesses of the corona epidemic and are therefore trying to do what is right and necessary, although they have to fight against the unreasonableness of many of their unreasonable employees and against the querulous part of the population. In Germany, only the man S divided by der stands out in this respect in Bavaria, and the man Kurz in Austria, while in your homeland, Switzerland, as in other European states, There are absolutely no state leaders who would be capable of doing their duty and taking the necessary measures against the epidemic and enforcing this in the willing as well as in the querulous parts of the populations. As we can see, the Swiss leadership in particular stands out in a negative way, if I may say so with your way of speaking, because none of the men and women who have the duty of fighting the epidemic in this leadership are capable of their office. So they are neither able to recognize the necessary measures against the epidemic, to work them out, to take them, to order them nor to have them carried out.
The whole nonsense of ordering short-term and only partial lockdowns for 1, 2 or 3 weeks in each case, in order to then loosen everything again or lift it completely, is already enough for a state of idiocy, because in this way, after the lockdown has been lifted, everything continues in the old style and consequently the whole mess gets even worse. If, however, those in power lack the necessary intelligence, which is still erroneously called intelligence today, then those in front of the populations and peoples who are incapable cannot get to the crux of the matter, because they are neither accessible to logical trains of thought nor can they foresee what will inevitably emerge and result from certain actions and behavior. And since these rulers are incapable in this way, they squander taxpayers' money on advisers who are supposed to give them advice, but who in reality also suffer from a horrendous lack of intelligence and are consequently also neither able to think logically, nor to foresee or even think ahead. But let us return to the epidemic. If all the government bubbleheads around the world, all the government council airheads and boneheads had done the right thing from the very beginning, when the epidemic broke out and grew into an epidemic, then no pandemic would have arisen, but the whole thing could have run its course within a short time of 2 to 3 months. This way, countless people would not have been infected by the epidemic and would not have died from it, and then the epidemic would not have begun to spread and claim many thousands of lives, as will now be the case from this month onwards. Many people have become depressed because of the epidemic, and suicides have also increased greatly, although this is officially denied. In addition, it is claimed that the spread of the epidemic will not increase any further, but this will be exactly the opposite, especially here in Europe, as I have observed together with Sfath. In the future, the whole thing will increase enormously, and now even more so with mass infections and fatalities, which will drive the whole thing up into the millions. As I have seen with Sfath in the future, since the effective first emergence of the precursor of the plague some 40 years ago, it has continued to mutate and evolve, as it did in laboratories, only to break out last December as the corona plague. If all this had not been the case and had finally come about as the corona plague, then it would never have come about that the stupid rulers would have come up with the crazy idea of irresponsibly incurring enormous national debts in order to provide emergency aid money to companies, corporations, sports, entertainment and all kinds of other companies and organizations, etc. Emergency aid money. This, as otherwise no debts would have come about in the populations and businesses, enterprises etc. and would not continue to accumulate from now on, due to the incompetence of those in power. However, I know from the time with Sfath when we were together. Well, you know, so I don't have to say anything more about it. This fact, however, cannot simply be eliminated, because the whole thing in this respect will escalate this month until December to such an extent that it will effectively crack in the woodwork of various banks themselves, because taxpayers' money will be squandered on government loans, which in turn will put the states into enormous debt. And the taxpayers will have to pay for these debts, which is not enough, because the descendants of today's taxpayers will also have to pay, and after them their descendants, and after them their descendants, and so on. If, however, imbeciles squat in the governments who have no idea of how to govern, then it is not surprising that the nonsensical national debt creation by the incompetent rulers will drive up the mountains of national debt to such an extent that one fine day collapse will take place, as can also happen, let us say, with earth humanity if it copulates with its own downfall and thereby exterminates itself, as it has often done since time immemorial. This is unfortunately the case with the earthlings, because from time immemorial, despite immense self-generated and also natural catastrophes, they have not become wiser or more humble, which is still the case today. Even if it is said that one becomes wise through harm, this does not apply to humanity, especially not to the giant Gra that has fallen prey to a delusion of God. This through harm one becomes wise can effectively only be understood and thus implemented by a few people in whom the intellect necessarily functions correctly and well, but unfortunately this is obviously not the case with the majority of earthlings.
You're not exactly making friends with that, even if it is as you say.
I don't want to either, because I only want to tell the truth. And if a person recognizes it as such, then he knows that it is effectively as I say, because then his intelligence is so far developed that he also uses it. So I don't have to make an effort to be hypocritical and make friends when I tell the truth. If, however, some intend to hate me or do, then that is their beer, which they must drink themselves or let go to waste, for I cannot drink it for them. That's good for me, because I'm ... Well, I'm glad if we don't have to talk about it anymore, because their whole thing wouldn't do any good anyway. This applies equally to the epidemic, because talking about it further will not bring it to a halt, but only by doing the right thing. You and I know what must be done, but no one will listen to us. That is certain. What needs to be done falls on the deaf ears and dulled senses of those in power, just as it does on that